The church was full. Every seat was taken. Cameras hovered silently. Red live lights glowed above the lenses, signaling that millions were watching in real time. The atmosphere felt warm, familiar, safe, the kind of place where nothing unexpected was supposed to happen. Joel Osteen stood at the center of the stage, smiling as always. Confident. In control. His voice had lifted spirits around the world, and today was no different. People leaned forward in their seats, ready for comfort, ready for hope, ready to hear what they already believed. Then Jonathan Roumie stepped forward. No dramatic entrance. No announcement. No music. Just a man walking calmly toward the microphone. At first, no one sensed what was about to unfold. Jonathan was known for portraying faith on screen, not challenging it in real life. The audience assumed this would be another polite conversation, another uplifting exchange between two public figures. But something felt different. Jonathan paused before speaking. Not the nervous pause of uncertainty, but the deliberate pause of someone choosing his words carefully. His eyes moved across the audience, then back to Joel. And that's when it happened. One question. Quietly spoken. Respectful. But heavy. So heavy that the air in the room seemed to change. The smile on Joel's face froze, just for a moment. Long enough for the cameras to catch it. Long enough for the audience to feel it. No one clapped. No one laughed. No one breathed. Because this wasn't a rehearsed line. This wasn't part of the program. This wasn't comfortable. This was a question people asked in private, but rarely dared to ask out loud. Especially on live television. Especially in a church. Jonathan didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. He didn't point fingers. That's what made it unsettling. His tone carried sincerity, not anger, conviction, not confrontation. And suddenly, the room understood. This moment was real. Producers backstage exchanged glances. The band didn't play. The cameras didn't cut away. They couldn't. Because millions at home were now leaning closer to their screens, sensing that something important was happening. Something unscripted, something raw, something no one could rewind. This wasn't about celebrity. This wasn't about ego. This wasn't even about Joel Osteen or Jonathan Roumie. It was about faith, and the questions people are afraid to ask when faith doesn't seem to work. For a brief moment, a massive church fell completely silent. No applause. No reaction. Just stillness. And in that silence, a single thought echoed through the room. Did he really just say that? What followed would divide opinions, flood social media, and spark conversations far beyond the church walls. But right here, in this frozen moment, no one yet knew how to respond. They only knew one thing. This was no longer just a sermon. And nothing would feel the same after what was said next. To understand why that moment felt so heavy, you have to understand the room it happened in. This wasn't just any church. This was a place built on optimism, light, and certainty. Every Sunday, thousands gathered here not to wrestle with doubt, but to rise above it. The messages were polished, reassuring, and carefully framed. People came carrying silent burdens, hoping to leave lighter than they arrived. And most of the time they did. Joel Osteen had mastered that atmosphere. His words were gentle but confident, designed to lift rather than confront. He spoke of favor, breakthrough, and purpose with a steady rhythm that made people feel safe. Even those who struggled felt seen, not judged, not pressured, just encouraged to keep believing. That morning was no different. The service flowed smoothly. Music swelled, hands rose, smiles spread across the room. The cameras followed every movement with practiced precision. Everything was on schedule. Everything was controlled. Then came the segment with Jonathan Roumie. To the audience, it looked simple. A guest appearance. A conversation. A shared moment between two men connected by faith. Jonathan was widely known for portraying Jesus on screen, but in person, he carried none of the grandeur people might expect. He dressed simply. He moved quietly. He listened more than he spoke. As he sat across from Joel, there was mutual respect, at least on the surface. Joel welcomed him warmly, praising his work and speaking about how stories of faith could inspire millions. The audience nodded along. This was familiar territory. This was safe. But Jonathan's posture told a different story. He wasn't tense. He wasn't defensive. He was thoughtful. As Joel spoke, Jonathan listened closely, his hands folded loosely, his eyes steady. He wasn't waiting for his turn to speak. He was absorbing every word. And when Joel finished, instead of responding with praise or agreement, Jonathan paused. It was subtle, but noticeable. The pause stretched just a second longer than expected. Those closest to the stage felt it first, a shift in energy, almost like the room leaned forward without realizing it. This wasn't hesitation. This was intention. Jonathan cleared his throat. And before he spoke, he did something unexpected. He acknowledged the people. Not the cameras. Not the platform. The people. He spoke about the ones watching from hospital beds. From empty apartments. From broken homes. From places where faith wasn't easy. He spoke gently, but his words carried weight. He talked about prayers whispered in desperation. About people who believed deeply, yet still suffered quietly. About faith that didn't always lead to victory, success, or applause. The room grew quieter. Some nodded. Others shifted in their seats. This wasn't where these conversations usually went. Jonathan wasn't criticizing. He wasn't accusing. He was setting the stage. He reminded the audience that belief doesn't erase pain. That faith doesn't always come with visible rewards. That sometimes, the most faithful people are the ones still standing, without answers. Joel listened attentively, his expression calm but focused. The familiar smile was softer now, more reserved. He nodded occasionally, but didn't interject. The band remained still. No music played underneath the words. No emotional cues were given. That silence mattered. Because silence removes distraction. It forces listening. Jonathan then spoke about expectations, the ones placed on faith leaders, on believers, on themselves. How easy it is to celebrate testimonies of success, and how uncomfortable it is to sit with stories that don't resolve neatly. The room felt different now. This was no longer a conversation meant to inspire quickly. This was a conversation meant to stay. People began to realize something important. Jonathan wasn't building toward praise. He was building toward a question. A question shaped by real pain. A question shaped by real faith. A question shaped by the people who believed, and still waited. And as Jonathan slowly leaned toward the microphone, the audience sensed it. This wasn't going to be a compliment. This wasn't going to be safe. This wasn't going to be forgettable. Whatever he was about to ask was about to change the tone of the entire room. And Joel Osteen knew it too. Jonathan leaned closer to the microphone. Not aggressively. Not dramatically. But just enough so that every word could reach every ear, every camera, every person watching at home. The audience held its breath. They knew something was coming, yet no one could anticipate its impact. He looked directly at Joel Osteen. Not with anger. Not with judgment. But with clarity. With sincerity. With the calm authority of someone who had seen the human heart in its rawest form. "Joel," Jonathan said softly, his voice steady and deliberate, "what do we say to the people who pray every single day, who wake up hoping for miracles, who cry in the night for answers, and yet they lose their jobs, their homes, their families, their hope?" The question landed like a stone in still water. For a moment, no one moved. The church had never been this quiet. Not during music. Not during sermons. Not during the applause that usually followed Joel's every line. Joel's expression changed. His usual confident smile faltered, replaced by the faintest crease of hesitation across his forehead. His eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in calculation. He was considering, internally, how to respond. How to maintain authority. How to soothe the discomfort rising in the room. The congregation shifted in their seats. Whispers rippled quietly, but the tension was palpable. Phones hovered mid-air, recording the scene that would soon explode across social media. Even the staff backstage felt a weight pressing down, a feeling that this was no longer scripted. Jonathan continued, his words deliberate, carrying a gentle but unshakable conviction. Faith isn't always about winning. Faith isn't always about blessing. Sometimes faith is about surviving. Sometimes faith is about standing tall in the middle of heartbreak when no one sees. And sometimes faith is about asking questions we are afraid to ask aloud. He paused, letting the words sink in. The silence stretched. It was not empty, it was heavy, charged, almost sacred in its tension. People swallowed hard, realizing the conversation had moved from surface-level inspiration to something much deeper, something uncomfortable, something real. Joel finally spoke. But he didn't answer immediately. He shifted in his seat, looking at Jonathan not with irritation, but with a measured pause. He was listening, truly listening. That pause alone was louder than any speech he could have given. The cameras captured every detail, the subtle tightening of his jaw, the flicker of thought across his eyes, the way the audience leaned forward in unison, as if gravity itself had pulled them closer to the truth in Jonathan's words. Jonathan's gaze remained unwavering. He didn't flinch under the scrutiny. He didn't hesitate under the weight of expectation. "I ask this because so many people are hurting, Joel," he said, softer now, almost whispering. "So many are believing, giving, hoping, and yet life doesn't answer the way we expect. What then?" The room held its breath again. Some members of the congregation pressed their hands to their mouths. Some stared blankly, unsure how to react. Some even closed their eyes, feeling the discomfort of Jonathan's question settle deep inside them. Joel's silence lasted longer than anyone anticipated. And in that silence, the magnitude of Jonathan's courage became clear. It was not easy to stand on live television, in front of millions of viewers, and confront someone as revered as Joel Osteen. It was not easy to raise the questions that no one dared to raise. Yet Jonathan did it with grace, with humility, and with unwavering honesty. Finally, Joel spoke, but the words were slower than usual. Measured, careful, considered. Those are hard questions, he admitted. Hard questions that we all wrestle with at some point in our lives. Even that response felt different. Genuine, real, vulnerable. The church had seen a confident figure in control, commanding attention, delivering polished inspiration. But now, for the first time, there was a crack, a glimpse of humanity that the audience hadn't fully seen before. Jonathan nodded slightly. He wasn't there to embarrass. He wasn't there to provoke conflict. He was there to ask the question that needed to be asked. The question that thousands of believers carried silently, alone, every day. "And that's why it matters," Jonathan added, his voice firm but calm. "Because faith doesn't just comfort us when life goes our way. Faith is tested when life breaks us, and it is in those moments we need the answers most. We need guidance. We need truth. And we need courage to face the reality that sometimes God's timing isn't ours. And sometimes the world is unfair, even to the faithful." The room remained silent, but now the silence was different. It wasn't heavy anymore. It wasn't shocked. It was reflective, contemplative. A moment of shared recognition that faith, hope, and humanity are far more complex than sermons or speeches can ever fully capture. Jonathan's challenge had landed. Not as confrontation. Not as rebellion. But as truth. And in truth, the church, and everyone watching, felt the weight of reality, undeniable and profound. The cameras kept rolling. The audience kept listening. And the moment that began as polite conversation had become something unforgettable. Something that would echo far beyond the walls of that church. Because Jonathan Roumie had asked the question everyone feared, and forced the room, including Joel Osteen himself, to truly consider the answer. For a long moment, the church remained completely still. Not the polite silence of a crowd waiting for the next cue. Not the quiet pause between songs. This silence was different. Heavy. Thoughtful. Uncomfortable. People glanced around nervously. Some lowered their heads, unsure whether to speak, unsure whether to breathe. Some held their hands to their mouths, feeling the weight of Jonathan's words settle deep in their chests. Cameras kept rolling, capturing every flicker of emotion, every subtle reaction. Millions at home were watching, and feeling it too. The band stopped playing. The choir, mid-note, froze in their posture. Even the ushers, trained to anticipate every moment, paused as if the room itself had pressed the pause button. No one moved. No one applauded. No one whispered. Everyone was listening. And the truth of the moment began to dawn. Jonathan's question wasn't a challenge in the usual sense. It wasn't about celebrity, ego, or confrontation. It was about reality. About the kind of reality millions experience silently every day. Faith tested, hope challenged, prayers unanswered. The camera zoomed in on Joel Osteen. His posture shifted subtly. Usually unflappable, he now appeared human, vulnerable. His smile, so familiar, was softened by contemplation. It was the first crack in a carefully maintained armor, and everyone in the room felt it. The congregation exchanged glances. Some whispered softly to the person next to them, unsure if they should respond or stay silent. Others closed their eyes and silently prayed, not for answers, but for understanding. It was in this silence that the power of the moment revealed itself. Because silence doesn't just mean stillness. Silence forces reflection. It forces honesty. It forces you to reckon with your own assumptions, your own biases, and your own heart. People began to realize, this wasn't just a question for Joel Osteen. It was a question for everyone present. A question for the millions watching at home. A question for anyone who had ever prayed, hoped, or believed in a higher purpose and felt the sting of unanswered prayers. An older woman in the front row shifted uncomfortably. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched her Bible. She had come expecting reassurance, inspiration, and certainty. Instead, she received challenge, and in that challenge, a mirror of her own doubts. A young man in the back muttered under his breath, "I thought I was the only one asking this." His eyes flickered toward Jonathan, a mix of awe and relief crossing his face. Relief that someone dared to voice what so many had buried inside. Even the church staff felt the shift. They were trained for smooth transitions, for moments of applause, for predictable inspiration. But now, they were witnesses to something raw, something unplanned, something real. And in the midst of it, Jonathan remained calm. He didn't speak louder. He didn't gesture dramatically. He simply let the silence hold the weight of his words. Joel finally exhaled. A subtle, human breath, almost imperceptible, but enough to signal that even he felt the gravity. He shifted in his chair, glanced at Jonathan, and nodded ever so slightly. Not in agreement, not in surrender, but in acknowledgement. He had heard. He had felt. And, for a brief moment, the roles had shifted. The preacher was listening, and the questioner had led. The audience at home didn't need more explanation. Clips of this moment began to circulate immediately. Comments flooded social media. "Did you see that pause?" He finally asked the question no one else would. Even Joel didn't know how to answer. The internet was abuzz, but in the church, the moment remained unbroken, intact, sacred. Some in the congregation began whispering quietly to each other, their voices cautious. "I never thought about it that way. I prayed for years and never got an answer. This is real." Even the children, sitting quietly in the pews, seemed to sense the shift. They didn't fully understand the question, but they felt the weight of the moment, the seriousness of faith meeting reality, and the courage it took to ask what no one dared to say aloud. And through it all, Jonathan's eyes never wavered. He didn't need to speak again. He didn't need applause or recognition. He had done what mattered most. He had voiced the question that demanded attention. It was in that silence, profound, uncomfortable, reflective, that the room collectively realized something important. Faith is not always comforting. Faith is not always safe. Faith is sometimes confronting, painful, and deeply human. The silence stretched, lingering, heavy and potent. Every person in the room felt it differently, but none could ignore it. Some felt shame. Some felt hope. Some felt clarity. Some felt fear. Because truth, when spoken, doesn't always need a response. It simply exists, and forces everyone to reckon with it. For Jonathan Roumie, the moment was complete. He had not shouted. He had not demanded attention. He had simply asked the question, held the silence, and let the truth speak for itself. And in that silence, the church, and the world watching, was forever changed. The silence in the church had stretched long enough to feel infinite. Every eye was on Jonathan Roumie. Every camera was rolling. Every person in the congregation, and millions at home, were holding their breath. Joel Osteen finally shifted in his seat. He cleared his throat softly, a subtle sign that he was gathering his thoughts. But this was not the confident, rehearsed response the audience was accustomed to. This was something different. Hesitation. Vulnerability. Reflection. Jonathan's eyes remained steady, calm, but filled with expectation. He had asked the question that so many avoided. He had given Joel no easy exit, no scripted cue, no applause line. And now, Joel had to face it, truly face it. I hear your question, Jonathan, Joel said slowly, each word deliberate. I hear it because it comes from the heart. And it reminds me that faith is not a promise of ease. Faith is not a guarantee that life will reward us in the ways we expect. He paused, and the room leaned in. The congregation, silent for so long, felt the weight of his admission. Even the production crew backstage seemed to hold their breath, sensing a pivotal moment unfolding before them. Joel continued, his voice softening. I've built my life teaching hope, yes. I've taught people that God can bless them, and that He desires good for them. But I also know that life is complicated. Pain happens. People suffer. Prayers go unanswered, and sometimes the path is long and dark and difficult. A murmur ran through the audience, not loud, not disrespectful, but an audible recognition. People nodded. Some wiped tears from their eyes. Some clasped their hands tighter, realizing that even leaders are human. Jonathan didn't speak. He didn't need to. His calm presence, his steady gaze, held the moment. It was a pause filled with meaning. It was a lesson in humility, courage, and truth. Joel shifted again, leaning forward slightly. He looked directly at Jonathan, and for the first time, there was no smile, only acknowledgement. You've asked the question that too many of us never dare ask aloud. And it's the question that should be asked, because it reminds us that faith isn't easy, and it isn't always clear. The cameras zoomed in on the congregation. Some people's faces were etched with relief. Some with recognition. Many were recording silently, understanding that this moment would be shared worldwide. Then Joel took a deeper breath and continued, his voice stronger now, but quieter than usual. I realize now that inspiration is not enough. Encouragement is not enough. People need honesty. They need guidance. They need someone willing to walk with them in the darkness, not just point to the light at the end of the tunnel. The words hung in the air. Heavy. Honest. Transformative. Jonathan finally nodded slightly, a subtle gesture of acknowledgement. It wasn't victory. It wasn't triumph. It was mutual respect. The kind that comes from speaking truth with courage and receiving it with humility. The church remained still, but the atmosphere had shifted completely. No longer was this a polished broadcast of hope delivered without challenge. Now it was real. Raw. Human. For the first time, Joel's demeanor softened entirely. His hands unclenched. His posture relaxed. He looked at the audience and admitted, I cannot promise that faith will erase all suffering. But I can promise, we will walk through it together. We will seek understanding, we will question, and we will hold on to hope, even when it is difficult. A quiet applause began, growing gradually, not forced or scripted, but genuine. The congregation wasn't cheering for a sermon, they were honoring courage. They were honoring honesty. They were honoring the truth that Jonathan had dared to speak, and Joel had chosen to face. Jonathan stood. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't claim victory. He simply let the moment exist, letting everyone absorb the gravity of what had transpired. And in that moment, millions at home watching, people who had struggled alone, who had prayed and received silence in return, felt seen. They felt heard. They felt validated. The reveal was clear. Faith is not about easy answers. Faith is not about always winning. Faith is about honesty, resilience, and courage, the courage to ask the hard questions and the humility to face them. Joel extended a hand toward Jonathan. A simple gesture. No fanfare. No cameras needed to capture it. Just respect. Just acknowledgement. Just humanity. And in that gesture, the message became universal. Leadership is not about avoiding hard truths. It's about facing them with grace. Faith is not about ignoring pain. It's about enduring it. And courage, real courage, sometimes comes from asking the questions everyone else fears. The church, for the first time that morning, was completely alive. Not with music, not with applause, but with recognition. Recognition that a moment had occurred that would not be forgotten. Recognition that faith, when confronted honestly, could be stronger than ever. Jonathan had challenged a leader. The leader had listened. And the world had learned something timeless. Courage and truth are always worth the silence, always worth the discomfort, and always worth the change they inspire. The tension in the room began to lift, not completely, but enough to let a new kind of energy settle in. Joel Osteen remained seated for a moment, still absorbing Jonathan Roumie's words and the weight of the silence that followed. The congregation, once frozen in uncertainty, now shifted in their seats, murmuring softly. But these weren't whispers of confusion anymore. They were whispers of understanding, of connection, of reflection. Jonathan remained standing near the microphone, calm, composed, and unassuming. He hadn't come to dominate the conversation or claim any spotlight. He hadn't raised his voice, waved his arms, or demanded applause. He had simply spoken truth, and now he allowed the moment to exist without interference. Finally, Joel rose from his chair. His usual confident smile had softened, replaced by something quieter, something more genuine. He walked toward Jonathan slowly, carefully, not to overshadow him, not to reclaim authority, but to acknowledge the courage it had taken to ask the questions everyone else had avoided. "I want to thank you, Jonathan," Joel said, his voice steady but filled with sincerity. "Not because you challenged me, but because you reminded me, and all of us, that faith is not always about comfort. It's about truth. It's about facing the hard questions. And it's about being present for people when life doesn't make sense." The congregation leaned in, sensing the authenticity in his words. People felt the shift. The moment had moved from confrontation to connection. What had begun as tension had transformed into understanding. Jonathan nodded slightly. He didn't speak immediately. He let the weight of Joel's acknowledgement settle, both for the leader on stage and for the millions watching at home. This was not about victory. This was about truth. This was about reflection. Some in the audience quietly wiped tears from their eyes. Some clasped hands in silent prayer. Others exhaled audibly, releasing the tension that had gripped the room for what felt like hours. The energy in the church was no longer heavy. It was alive, thoughtful, and deeply human. Joel continued, now addressing the entire congregation. "From today forward, let this moment remind us that honesty in faith is just as important as hope. That acknowledging struggle does not weaken belief. And that courage, both in asking questions and in listening, makes us stronger together." There were nods, murmurs of agreement, and quiet expressions of gratitude. The moment had become bigger than either of the two men on stage. It belonged to the audience. It belonged to anyone who had ever faced hardship and wondered why their prayers hadn't been answered. Jonathan finally stepped back slightly, breaking the intensity of the moment with a small, humble smile. He looked at the people around him, the congregation, the staff, the production team, and then at Joel. "Faith is not about certainty," he said softly. "It's about perseverance, honesty, and the willingness to confront the questions no one else will." Joel nodded again, a silent agreement that spoke louder than any applause. "And courage like yours," he said, gesturing toward Jonathan, "can remind all of us why faith must be real, even when it's uncomfortable." The room, for the first time in that morning's broadcast, began to breathe collectively. A soft ripple of applause rose, gentle but genuine, not scripted or expected. People weren't cheering a performance. They were honoring courage, humility, and the rare willingness to speak truth to power in a sacred space. Backstage, the producers exchanged glances. They knew this moment would be replayed, shared, and analyzed for years. It was raw. It was unplanned. It was unforgettable. And it had changed everything, even if subtly, for everyone present. As the broadcast drew to a close, Jonathan quietly walked toward the exit. He didn't linger for selfies or media attention. He had made his point. He had asked the question. He had offered clarity. And now, the moment was complete. Joel watched him go, a thoughtful expression on his face. He returned to the congregation with renewed energy, not to give another sermon, but to reflect the lesson Jonathan had brought to the stage. Humility, honesty, and courage matter more than appearances, more than applause, and more than the comfort of certainty. And as people began to leave the church that morning, many carried with them a new understanding. That faith is real, even when life is hard. That questions do not diminish belief. That courage and humility, together, can transform any room, any conversation, and any heart. Jonathan Roumie's visit would be remembered not for the spotlight or the cameras, but for the quiet, powerful lesson he delivered. Sometimes, the greatest impact comes not from speaking louder, but from speaking truth. And sometimes, the room has to go silent before anyone truly hears. The church had returned to its normal rhythm, but nothing about that morning would ever feel the same. The congregation had experienced more than a sermon. They had witnessed courage, honesty, and humility in action. A moment where faith wasn't polished, scripted, or convenient. A moment where questions were asked, and truths were faced. And in that silence, something profound had been revealed. Faith, when honest, is stronger than comfort. Jonathan Roumie had not come to challenge for the sake of drama. He had not sought to embarrass or prove a point. He had come to remind everyone, quietly but powerfully, that real faith isn't about perfection. It isn't about answers neatly packaged. It isn't about always inspiring applause. Real faith asks hard questions. Real faith endures pain. Real faith stays present when life doesn't make sense. Joel Osteen had listened. He had faced the question. And he had responded, not with defensiveness, but with humility. That willingness to pause, reflect, and acknowledge uncertainty is what made the moment so unforgettable. Leadership isn't only about guidance, it's about courage to confront truth, even when it challenges your own comfort. For the audience, for the millions at home, the lesson was clear. Respect and honesty are not earned by status or applause. They are earned by courage, by listening, and by the willingness to confront the reality of human struggle with compassion and integrity. Sometimes, the quietest voices carry the loudest lessons. Sometimes, the questions we fear to ask are the ones that matter most. And sometimes, the people who challenge us remind us of what we may have forgotten. That faith is not just hope, it is honesty, endurance, and love in action. So remember this. Never fear asking the hard questions. Never underestimate the power of humility. Never overlook the strength it takes to speak truth with kindness. Because one day, the person you challenge, or the question you ask, might be the very thing that transforms a room, a heart, or even a life. Type truth in the comments if you believe faith is stronger when it's honest. And share where you're watching from. Let's honor the courage of those who ask, listen, and face reality with love.